I would. So anybody else? Anybody with me? Most of the women? Hopefully. Okay. All right. Does anybody watch Victoria on PBS? It just started about Queen Victoria. No? Okay. They talk quite a bit about her fragile psyche and about her being prone to hysteria and things like that, sort of the times, the language, and so it's very similar to that. Okay, so that's one criticism of Freud. What could another criticism of Freud or psychoanalysis as a theory be?
All dreams have meanings.
All dream has meaning, right? I think some of us thought maybe they did, and some of us thought maybe they didn't. What else? What does Freud focus a lot on? I mean, there's a couple things. What does he focus on more than anything? Sex?
Suppressed sexual desires problems come from unconsciousness.
Right, okay, so sex and the fact that because we are thinking about sex all the time, which maybe isn't comfortable or doesn't get us very far in social interactions, we suppress that, and where does it go? Our unconscious, right? And that's, he thinks, where everything is sort of brewing before it comes to the surface, right? And if things are down there and there's conflicts and they aren't dealt with, what happens? We don't forget about them. If they're not resolved, what do? They cause anxiety. They can cause other depression, right? All sorts of, they cause problems, right? Problems for us. So we need to be able to resolve them. Okay, so, and are Freud's theories, are all of them or many of them like scientifically provable? No, right? Okay, so that's a big problem if we're trying to think about science and psychology as a science. All right, so Jung he agrees with Freud in many aspects, and he agrees with this psychoanalytic perspective, but he has his own ideas about some things as well. One of the biggest contributors that Jung has to the field of psychoanalysis, I think, is the idea of what we call the collective unconscious. Is anyone familiar with that term? The collective unconscious? Well, what does it sound like?
Everything that you have when you are unconscious together.
Together with maybe who? What's a collective? So in Jung's thinking, all human beings share what he calls this collective unconscious. So that means that all of us across time and across culture and geographically have some shared pieces of our unconscious. What do you guys think about that? Is it like, do you think it's possible or likely that you have somewhere in your unconscious a shared image or thought, something that somebody in 6th century Japan could have also had? Or somebody in modern day Papua New Guinea might also have?
With the possibilities.
Reincarnation.
Reincarnation, I see what you're saying. I think that would apply to me more of it. We're talking about like a tiny something. What do we know about different, say, modern religions or different cultural stories or myths or things like that? Do you guys, historically, do you know about any similarities between them? Well, what are the three, what's that? Belief in a higher power. What are the three monotheistic religions?
Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all originated from Abraham.
Okay, and what do they all believe in? What's a unifying theme? God. Okay. And there are other religions, not polytheistic, and other animism, Shintoism, but they all give some sort of supernatural properties to something, right? So these religious beliefs, there are images of what does a mother represent to most everyone, usually? Love, nurturing, that sort of thing, right? That's a common thing. What about if people, and this could be, you know, you could look back in text, and I'm not saying you could find it everywhere. I don't know, you know, we don't know what we could find everywhere, certainly. But what is the image of like something with the pointy horns and a pointy tail, often? The devil, right? And we could see that if we looked in texts from hundreds of years ago, even thousands of years ago, this idea, the idea of a flood myth or representation as a flood is something that cleanses a society or does something like that. So there are some shared, now we can't prove this because we don't know what every society across time, across geography, across every culture thought. But there is enough evidence, I think, and Jung thought, that we all sort of have this shared collective unconscious of some certain things that have shaped humans and the way we develop to some extent. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that there are some similarities?
We all feel the same way. We all have to have some part of consciousness.
Okay. We do all develop, I mean, our development is shaped by things, right? Nature and nurture and all that sort of thing. But we do all develop in generally the same order and the same way, from conception to birth and, you know, childhood and all that. All right, so there are those similarities. Any other thoughts on this, on what Jung thought? Anybody agree that maybe there's pieces of that? I see some. I can see some, certainly. Okay. So he thinks that's the reason, this collective unconscious, that many cultures share these myths and images and symbols and things like that over time. All right. And then a second figure that I wanted to just touch on briefly before we finish up psychoanalysis is a guy named Alfred Adler. So Adler is another neo-Freudian, okay, another student of Freud's that's following in the psychoanalytic footprint. And he agrees with the idea that we go through these childhood tensions, you know, Freud's psychosexual stages that we talked about. But Adler thinks that instead of being sexual tensions, they are social tensions. So that kids go through things, what kind of social struggles do kids go through growing up?
Puberty.
What's that?
Puberty.
Puberty, tough, right?
Like wanting to, like, learning how to share things with
Yep,
others.
absolutely. Those social structures and norms, what's expected.
Trends.
What's that?
Trending.
Yep. What else? Right or wrong. Yep, developing that moral code. Adler thinks that we've got a lot of it that we struggle with is the struggle for or against this inferiority complex idea. What's something that we deal with as children, as little kids? What's often something we're struggling to do?
Listen.
Yeah, that's certainly from, what's that? Talk.
Taking direction.
Take direction. What else do we have to learn?
Behavior.
Manners, behaviors. We have to learn how to feed ourselves, how to dress ourselves, how to tie our shoes, all these things. What can learning that kind of stuff? Frustration, right? So we can often get, does anybody currently, if you're trying to learn, I don't know, maybe somebody's taking a ceramics class or you're trying to learn a new language or something, what happens when you know, are learning often?
Trial and error.
Trial and error, and you feel, anybody feel frustrated when they can't get it? I do, okay. So if I'm trying to learn something new, even if, you know, maybe cook a new recipe or learn a new skill and I can't get it, it's frustrating. Especially say you're in a class and it feels like everybody else is getting it, but we're not. So that can lead to that idea of like an inferiority complex, right? So Adler thinks that's one of the main contributors to how we're sort of developing as children, dealing with this inferiority complex and facing that, and how we sort of come out on the other side of that. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a change to how Freud thinks we're developing things. All right, so that's Jung and Adler. Those are two of the neo-Freudians that I want you guys just to have an idea of, that are also part of that psychoanalytic perspective as one of the modern perspectives.
How do you spell neo-Freudian?
Neo-Freudian. Yep. All right, so we are going to move on now to another of the modern perspectives or modern schools of psychology. The next school of thought we're going to talk about is the behavioral school. So some of this you guys will see you have seen or you will see on the recorded lecture. The behavioral school focuses on, what do you think? Behavior, yep. And they focus only on behavior. They are not interested in our mental processes. They're definitely not interested in our thoughts, our feelings. They are not interested in our unconscious, anything we can't see or access. Okay, so on the scientificness scale, where do you think the behavioral perspective falls? More or less scientific than, say, the psychoanalytic perspective?
More visible.
Yeah, much more. Why is that?
Because it's things you can observe, try it again, and observe it multiple times.
Observe, replicate, right, all that sort of thing. So, the behavioral school is particularly interested in learning, which is, if we talk about learning, a basic definition could be the acquisition of behavior, right? So, what is learning? It's getting a new behavior, whatever that behavior may be. We talked a little bit about what behaviors might be in the beginning of class when we talked about the definition of psychology. What is the definition of psychology? Remind me.
Study of behaviors and mental processes.
The scientific study of behaviors and mental processes. Okay, so what are some behaviors? Observable, overt things. So what could a behavior be?
Attitude.
How would we observe attitude? We can, but we'd have to define that.
I guess by their emotions, facial expressions, body language.
Facial expressions and body language we can observe, okay? So if we want to define attitude by facial expressions or body language, what's an example we could use? How might someone demonstrate a positive attitude? Smiling. Okay, what else?
Their hand-on gesture. Usually people that are angry or frustrated, they have arms
They might, okay, so arms crossed might be sort of a negative attitude trait. Arms open or at your sides might be positive. What facial expressions or body language could we observe for negative attitude or define for negative attitude? Frowning, we said arms crossed, right? So there are different ways that we can define attitude in terms of looking at it in terms of behavior, okay? What's something else? What's another behavior we might study or observe?
Take notes, or they just listen to you.
Okay, note-taking style or the behavioral characteristics of students in a college lecture, right? So what are a couple different ways we could define behaviors? Some people are going to be taking notes by hand. What else might people do? How else would I define some behaviors?
Take notes on your laptop.
Take notes on your laptop, okay?
They're like
Actively
actively listening.
listening, so we would define active listening as something observable by
Participation.
eyes up, eye contact, maybe you see people nodding along, things like that, okay? What else? What other kinds of behaviors could we see? Participation, so that can be defined as raising your hand, answering questions, communication, volunteering information. Okay, so there are ways that we can define things behaviorally in terms of overt behavior to be able to study them. Okay. So, we've got a couple different figures majorly associated with behavior. Did anybody who got the chance to see the lecture, can you tell me some of the figures mentioned as part of behaviorism and also as part of classical conditioning? Pavlov is one. And Watson. Okay, so John Watson is a behavioral psychologist who's very associated with the school, and particularly in the classical conditioning side of things. So classical conditioning is one part of the behavioral school that we're going to focus on. So John Watson gets a lot of his ideas, of which he has many, on human behavior from an earlier researcher named Pavlov. So John Watson thinks that that everything about us, everything about our personality, our actions, what we do in life, the kind of person we are, is all about how we have learned behaviors from birth until wherever we're at in life. Okay, so all about how we've acquired learned behaviors from our environment. So a quote, I'm going to read you a quote of Watson, and this is sort of a good representation, I think, of what he thinks. So Watson says that if you give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, so physically formed, and his own specified world to bring them up in, he can guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist. He can raise a doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a shop owner, a beggar, a thief, any type of person that you give him, regardless of his talents, of his tendencies, abilities, vocations, race, his parents, his genetics, anything like that. All right, that's John Watson's view on humans. What do you guys think about that? And that's around 1930, Watson is.
To me, it's almost all true.
Okay.
Because, I mean, some people just can't handle different tasks because of just the way the brain works, limitations. But sometimes some people, like me, I'm going back to school right now. For science, they didn't want to do that before. So it's.
So you're not going to fully commit to Watson, right? It's not all just learned behavior. What does this conversation sound like, guys, a little bit? What's something, that debate we talked about in the beginning of... What affects us? The environment or our genetics? And other words for those might be...
Nature versus
nature and nurture, right? So if Watson is saying that everything is based on being taught something, everything is based on a response to an environmental stimuli, a learned stimuli, what is he saying? What side of the debate is he on? Nurture. And is he 50%, 80%, 100%? 100%, he's fully committed to this idea, right? What does that sound like when we talked about sort of the historical, philosophical roots of society? Do you guys remember that early philosopher that thought we were born sort of fully cooked? It was all there?
That was.
That we all had that innate knowledge? Starts with a P, Plato. Yep. Plato similarly to this, right? That we're all sort of born with everything that we need, it's all there. Okay, that's all on the nurture side. So, for review, what would the sort of antithesis of that be?
Have everything that we need in our brain, and we just have to kind of expose, once it is exposed, then we kind of learn what it is.
Right, that's what Plato says, right? It's all there, we just have to get to it. Who was the opposite of Plato? Aristotle, and what side of things was he on?
Blank slate.
Blank slate, right? Tabula rasa. So he would be on which side, nature or nurture?
That being nurture. Or nature.
Nature, right? That we are born unformed, we've got nothing. So, okay, all right. So, when we think about behaviorism, we're thinking fully about nurture. Okay. In reality, what do we think, most of us? I know we talked about this briefly. Do we think it's a mix, a percentage, a blend?
Yeah.
Yeah, people have different theories for the most part on, is it more nature, more nurture, right? Is it more genetics or more environment? But we're somewhere along some balance between the two. Okay, so that's what Watson thinks. So Watson, again, gets his ideas from this guy called Pavlov. And Pavlov is the researcher that comes up with this early idea of classical conditioning. Does anyone know what conditioning is? To be conditioned to do something?
It's repetitive training.
Yeah, training, learning, okay. So, classical conditioning, another name for that could be what we're gonna call passive learning. Any thoughts or ideas on what something we might learn passively? What we're learning right now, are you guys learning passively or actively? Actively. You are putting energy into trying to learn something, okay? What's something that you might learn passively?
What you mentioned in the lecture was that we've learned to respond to like the vibrations or the rings or the bells of our phones without actually intending to.
Sure, very good, right? So we didn't try to do that, it just happens, right? We've learned, but without us putting effort forth, to respond to our phones and to our own tones at some point, right? So that's an idea or a way of passive learning. Okay, so Pavlov comes up with this classical conditioning and passive learning, and I went over this again in the lecture. And it's because he has his dogs and he notices, or the research assistants notice, that the dogs do what? Anyone remember? They salivate in response to what? A bell ringing, right? Why do they do that?
Because they always brought food in and the door would ring, right?
Right, okay, so they got used to a bell ringing immediately before they were fed, right? So we're gonna go through the different components of classical conditioning. So we have what's called an unconditioned stimulus. So we could call unconditioned, what's another word for unconditioned? Unlearned, good. We've got a neutral stimulus. And we have a conditioned or what? What's another word for conditioned? Learned. So, if we have an unconditioned stimulus, unlearned, we would then have an unlearned response. Does that make sense? Okay. So, that would be an unconditioned response. If we have a conditioned stimulus, we're gonna have a conditioned response. So we learn, it's unlearned or it's learned. So in classical conditioning, these are going to be the sort of 5 elements in any scenario of classical conditioning that we could go through. So using the idea of Pavlov that I went over in the lecture, what is the unconditioned stimulus?
The food.
The food. The dogs do not need to learn, right, to do what? What's the unconditioned response?
Salivate.
So the dog smells something good, food. What do you guys salivate in response to? Bacon?
Yes.
Yeah, that's usually a good one for people, right? You smell something good on the stove, and you don't need to learn to salivate. Our bodies just do that. They're like, oh, that smells good. I want to eat that, so I'm going to salivate and get my body ready to eat and digest. Okay, so unconditioned, unlearned stimuli is food, and the response is the salivation. Now, what does the bell represent? What would we do when we hear a bell? Just on its own. What would a dog do?
Oh, nothing.
Right? Nothing. It doesn't mean anything. So it's going to be the neutral stimuli, right? On its own, that bell means nothing to a dog if they haven't learned anything yet. So, if I have a neutral stimulus and it means nothing to me, do I get a response from it? No. It doesn't mean anything, it doesn't do anything for us. Okay? Alright. Now, what about the conditioned stimulus? What are we gonna learn to be stimulated by?
The bell.
The bell, right? And specifically, it's the pairing of the bell and the food, right? So it's the pairing of the unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus that gives us the conditioned stimulus, okay? So food plus bell gives you bell that's conditioned to give you this conditioned response. So what is the conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus? What's the response?
Salivation.
Salivation in response to which stimulus, or to what?
The bell.
The bell. All right, what do we think about that? Make sense? Okay. So what we're gonna do is, I have emailed you guys access to a Google Doc. We're gonna do another example here in class, and then for your homework for Friday, there's 3 examples total. You'll do the other 2. You may want to, if you can, either jot these down or pull up the examples so you kind of know where we're at. So what we're going to be doing is just what we just did. We're going to have a scenario like Pavlov's dog situation, and we're going to identify each of these 5 factors from that scenario, okay? Let me read it so I make sure it's consistent with what I'm sending or what I sent you. Okay, so you've got 3 scenarios that I sent to you. We're gonna do the first one together. The first one says, Geraldine had a car accident at the corner of 32nd Street and Cherry Avenue. Whenever she approaches the intersection now, she begins to feel uncomfortable, her heart begins to beat faster, she gets butterflies in her stomach, and her palms become sweaty. Okay, so a woman has a car accident at a specific intersection, and now when she goes to that intersection, I'm gonna call it anxiety. We'll describe this behavior, right? Uncomfortable feelings, increased heart rate, kind of nauseous or butterflies and sweaty palms. Can we all agree that that's anxiety?
Yeah.
Okay, so every time she comes to this intersection, she gets anxious. Got it? Okay, so what are the different components? Take a minute to think about it if you want. And then we're gonna identify each of these 5 components. All right, a woman has a car accident at a specific intersection. Whenever she goes to that intersection now, she begins to get anxious. We're gonna turn that little synopsis into these 5 components.
Did you want to write that down?
You don't have to write it down. The first one, you won't have to answer for your homework. We're just gonna do it in class. But I find, well, it really depends on how you learn. I find in these instances, I write it out because I can see things better. Does anybody think they have any of the components figured out? Okay?
With the intersection and neutral stimulus?
Yes, the intersection on its own is the neutral stimulus because a normal or rational person, or Geraldine pre-accident, would that intersection mean anything to you? No. Okay, so the intersection on its own, or to any of us, is the neutral stimulus. So any of us is in the car, we drive up to this intersection, what happens?
Car accident.
Well, no, just in general, to you.
Oh, no.
Nothing, right? We're not, just on its own, we're not producing any kind of response, okay? Who thinks they have another component figured out here?
The unconditioned is gonna be the car accident.
The unconditioned stimulus or response? Oh, this should have a U, I'm sorry.
That's gonna be, the stimulus.
Okay, so the accident is gonna be the unconditioned stimulus, because why?
It wasn't learned, it just happened.
Right, it just happened, but what has it taught you without you trying?
Anxiety.
Anxiety, right? If you have a car accident, is it normal to possibly feel some anxiety around something about that? Okay, so we don't have to learn it, we just do. So what is the anxiety here?
The unconditioned response.
Good, the unconditioned response, right? You get in a car accident and then some factor relating to that car accident causes, talking about accidents, I should say anxiety, causes you some anxiety, and maybe it's just getting back in your car after the accident, maybe it's, I don't know, thinking about it, somebody talking about it, whatever it is. In this case, for Geraldine, it's gonna be what? What is going to be her conditioned stimuli?
The intersection.
The intersection, right? So, the intersection, which previously meant nothing, has taught her to feel what?
Anxiety.
Okay? So anxiety is her conditioned response, right? She learned to feel anxious at this intersection. And she learned it because in unconditioned stimuli, the accident was paired with a neutral stimulus, which gave us a conditioned stimulus. Okay, so you guys get the idea there? Okay, so I sent you 2 other scenarios, which you should have. If you can't open it, let me know. And what I'd like you to do for your homework for Friday is just to do the same thing we did here. You don't have to draw it out this way, you can just say, just label it. Yep, that's fine. And you can email me the labels, you know, question 2 and question 3, or you can print it out and write it. I don't mind any of those forms. Okay? Any questions on that? All right, on Friday, I'd also like you to read a little bit in your textbooks, if you have them, about operant conditioning, which is the other kind of learning we're going to go over as part of the behavioral school. Okay? If classical conditioning is passive learning, operant conditioning is going to be active learning. Okay? So we're going to go over that, on Friday. Any questions about any of that? Okay, great. Let me know, guys, if for some reason you can't open this link, but you should.
That's fine.
Everybody's got it? Okay. All right, sounds good. Then I'll see you on Friday.